In the Friday the 13th fanbase, Jason Voorhees enthusiasts are divided into two separate and equally important groups. Traditionalists who love the hockey mask of which he is best known, and those who prefer the burlap sack from Friday the 13th Part 2. I am the latter. Guilty as charged. I was born a Baghead Jason fan and I'll die a Baghead Jason fan. Let's deep dive into my personal favourite Jason in my personal favourite film of the franchise. I am such a man-child. Hey there and welcome to Home Drive-In. While not a critical victory, the original Friday the 13th proved a surprise hit with audiences, earning a bag of cash for Paramount, which were, of course, eager to repeat its success. Today we unpack a fan favourite of the Friday the 13th series with Friday the 13th Part 2, which I will be discussing in detail, so there will be a burlap sack of spoilers ahead. And if you are new to this channel, welcome aboard. If you do enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and even consider hitting those subscribe and notification buttons. But for now, let's explore the movie that first handed the murderous reins to horror movie legend Jason Voorhees, and let's begin. Friday the 13th Part 2 begins 2 months following the events of the original, when sole survivor Alice Hardy is murdered in her home by a mysterious assailant. 5 years later, a group of young people arrive at a training facility for camp counselors not far from Crystal Lake, where serial killer Mrs Voorhees carried out her vengeful massacre. When half the group hits the local bar for a night on the town, the few that remain behind are quietly stalked by a hooded figure, assumed to be Mrs Voorhees' son, Jason. With the surprise success of the original Friday the 13th, Paramount Pictures was, unsurprisingly, quick to start planning a sequel. However, with its antagonist definitively killed off by the original sole survivor Alice, there's really no coming back from a decapitation, it was uncertain just how the story could continue. As would be suggested for the Halloween franchise, Friday the 13th was proposed to become an anthology, with a series of unrelated films set around the unlucky date. However, Phil Scuderi, one of the original film's financiers, insisted upon a direct sequel featuring Jason Voorhees, the original killer's son, as the new antagonist. However, considering that Jason's drowning as a child was the sole motivation for the events of the first film, a few people were a little puzzled at this idea. This included director Sean S. Cunningham, who, while happy with the success of his original, was also puzzled about the popularity of horror films in general. He also admitted his direction on the original film was just a stepping stone to bigger and better things, and thus declined to direct the sequel. However, one person who believed that the only way forward was for Jason to return was Friday the 13th associate producer Steve Miner. Miner, who had a working history with Cunningham that included collaborating with director Wes Craven on The Last House on the Left, was approached by Scuderi about producing the sequel. However, an ambitious Steve Miner also put his hand up to direct, prompting Scuderi to consult Cunningham to see if he was ready for such a challenge. Cunningham gave his endorsement on the condition that his wife be given the role of editor, which Miner agreed to and thus landed his first ever job as a film director. Under the working title Jason, Miner wanted to make a worthy follow-up by keeping things familiar yet still offering something fresh, and collaborated with the new film's screenwriter. Also shocked at the success of the first film was writer Victor Miller, who nonetheless also declined to return, with script duties handed to Ron Kurtz, who had assisted with the story on the original. Kurtz's biggest challenge was explaining Jason's return, yet he instead focused on the lore surrounding his state of mind, rather than explaining his whereabouts for the past 35 years. In a nutshell, it's easier to buy if you don't think about it. Yet above all, Kurtz was determined to write a screenplay that would include some likeable and, this time, somewhat more relatable characters. Steve Miner even quipped that they deliberately avoided things like strip monopoly as seen in the first film. But damn, I wanted to see how that played out. Amy Steele, who began her career as a model and also appeared in several commercials, was encouraged by her agent to audition for the lead role. While no fan of horror films, she agreed and won the role of lead counselor and child psychology major Ginny Fields, who incidentally was named after the film's production designer. Actor John Fury seemed fated to appear in the film since he was not only born on, but also auditioned for his role on a Friday the 13th. Auditioning for camp coordinator Paul Holt, Fury was given the choice of which scene he'd like to read, and selected the now iconic campfire story scene. Following his audition, Steve Miner offered Fury the role by inviting him to go and see The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as a way to introduce the actor to horror films. Bill Randolph landed his role of Jeff after sharing an audition with an actress reading for his on-screen girlfriend, who allegedly took her enthusiasm to a whole new level. The young lady seemed overwhelmed at having scored an audition and overacted to such a degree that Randolph and Miner couldn't help giving one another a look of utter bewilderment. Randolph insisted that this bonding over her bizarre performance ultimately helped to win him the role. Randolph had also been close friends with Kevin Bacon, who coincidentally played Jack in the original, and realised he would be playing what is often referred to as Bacon's Part 2 equivalent. Thus, to make his character unique, he devised a backstory for Jeff as a city kid whose only motivation to be a camp counselor was to impress his girlfriend and get laid. And spoiler alert, mission accomplished. Stu Charno was a musician known for his witty lyrics and was approached by a casting director who asked if he was a comedian, to which he quickly responded, "Well, I do feel funny." She advised him to try acting, which ultimately led to his role of Ted, the film's practical joker, who Steve Miner allowed to improvise much of his on-screen antics. At almost 18 years of age, Lauren Marie Taylor had just finished high school, having a few Burger King commercials to her name by the time she auditioned for her role as Vicky. Her excitement at winning the part, however, was tainted when she was shown the original Friday the 13th in preparation, where she began to feel a little concerned. Being before Kevin Bacon's rise to stardom, it dawned on her that she had never seen or heard from any of the cast members from the original film since, wondering if it had actually been a snuff film.
You're all doomed.
Her concerns were eased when she realised the film was indeed legit, which is not to say the original Friday the 13th didn't present a very real danger for one returning cast member. Adrienne King was invited to return for a greater role in the sequel, however, at the time she was dealing with the very real horror of an obsessed stalker. Wanting to maintain a low profile, she nonetheless agreed to appear in the prologue, which was filmed over a couple of days toward the end of production. It was originally believed she declined to star in the sequel due to a pay dispute, which the actress herself has declared as untrue. The prologue infamously kills off King's character while dedicating 12 of the film's already scant 85-minute runtime to catch the audience up with the events of the original. And regrettably, despite all she'd already been through, King wouldn't leave her brief couple of days on set without incident. The retractable ice pick used for her death scene failed to do the one thing it was supposed to: retract, and drove its way right into her cheekbone. Injury aside, however, King would admit that the worst part of her shoot was the hideous jumpsuit she was required to wear, later quoting, "The wardrobe lady must have hated me." Walt Gorney also makes a welcome return as Crystal Lake's prophet of doom, Crazy Ralph, who sadly also falls victim to Jason's wrath in the first half of the film. In retrospect, Steve Miner regretted killing off Gorney's character and wished he'd kept him around to make further appearances in the series. Hey, maybe Crazy Ralph should have killed Jason. Now that would have been cathartic. And speaking of casting Friday 2's villain, where do we even begin with that controversy? While screen credit for Jason goes to Warrington Gillette, by many reports the actor himself actually did very little Jasoning. Gillette originally auditioned to play Paul, yet when John Fury got the part, the producers still wanted to keep him around and offered him the role of Jason. However, it became apparent that Gillette was not able to perform the more physical actions required for the role, which is where stunt person Steve Dash took over. So while it is indeed Gillette under the grotesque makeup in the finale, it is widely reported that Dash performed the majority of Jason's scenes. Sadly, Dash only received a screen credit as Jason's stunt double, despite immersing himself in the role by carefully developing Jason's posture and movements. Furthermore, Friday the 13th Part 2 would be the first and only time that Jason is played by a woman, as seen during the prologue when the other cast members had left production. Therefore, the leg scene approaching Alice's house actually belonged to costume designer Ellen Lutter, making her the first person ever to appear on screen as the adult Jason Voorhees. Friday the 13th Part 2 was provided a production budget of $1.3 million and was filmed during the fall of 1980 on a schedule lasting approximately 8 weeks. Filming took place in Connecticut, including New Preston, Walcott and Waterbury, with the majority of production taking place in the small, picturesque town of Kent. The town was a culture shock for some of the cast and crew, particularly Lauren Marie Taylor, who was so used to the noise of urban life that she found the quiet location suitably creepy. And if there was anything indicative of the low budget of this film, keep this in mind. Amy Steele apparently mentioned that she received more residuals for the brief moment of Friday the 13th Part 2 that appears in the 2014 comedy Mean Girls than she did for starring in the film itself. That is so not fetch. While filming got off to a relatively straightforward start with all daytime shots completed within the first couple of weeks, things took an interesting turn thereafter. Since the bulk of the film takes place at night, the majority of the shoot required the schedule to begin in the late afternoon, early evening. Of course, shooting at night went hand in hand with freezing temperatures, meaning that the lake scene with actress Kirsten Baker had to be filmed quickly before the cold became unmanageable. Baker was required to appear nude, yet was a good sport about filming the scene, and according to the actress, was swiftly dried off with a jet engine in between takes. Yet the timetable unsurprisingly took its toll on all of the young actors as they became practically nocturnal, shooting all night and then attempting to sleep during the day. With their schedule often finishing up at 6 a.m, a buffet breakfast would be provided each morning, featuring all manner of delicious breakfast foods, ranging from toast, eggs, bacon, and Jack Daniels? Since the cast and crew were lodging at a nearby camp, they would stagger back after their boozy breakfast, the assumed purpose of which was to help them get to sleep during daylight hours. Being of similar age, the ordeal became a bonding experience for them, with friendships quickly blossoming and, of course, all manner of youthful hijinks. They apparently loved to scare one another, especially when it came time for bed, where they'd scratch on the cabin windows of their colleagues while they tried to sleep. Lauren Marie Taylor went on record to say she had quite the crush on many of her male co-stars, yet none more than her on-screen crush Mark, played by the late Tom McBride. Her on-screen character Vicky became a fan favourite, largely due to her tenacious romantic pursuit of McBride's character. And from the actress's perspective, Vicky declared her intentions and was not subtle in letting Mark know about it. However, Lauren's true-life crush on her co-star would only get her so far, since McBride was an openly gay actor, who later became one of the faces of the Winston cigarette billboard adverts. McBride sadly passed away from complications due to AIDS in 1995 and is fondly remembered by his fellow Friday the 13th cast and crew as a quiet, down-to-earth and gentle soul. Steve Miner, being a first-time director, demonstrated professionalism on set, yet still allowed his actors to take several liberties with their characters. Amy Steele, for example, gave her character considerable thought, and by extension Jason, coming up with her own outline for the film's somewhat tragic foe. Much of this carried over to Ginny's discussion with Paul and Ted at the bar, where she profiles Jason as a troubled child whose inferiority carried over to adulthood, motivated purely by his devotion to his mother. This philosophy would, of course, become evident in Jason's face-off with Ginny, in a scene that would well and truly cement her as one of the franchise's favourite protagonists. Reinforcing her pre-established child psychology studies and Jason's practically infantile mindset, at film's conclusion, Ginny attempts to psych him out by pretending to be his mother. The scene was a subversion of expectations, as it's one of the few moments in the franchise and the slasher genre at the time that attempts to humanise its villain. Yet psychological profiling aside, bringing the scene to life involved the very welcome return of the franchise's original antagonist.
Jason, Mother is talking to you.
There was probably no one more confused by Jason's return than Betsy Palmer, yet being a supporter of Steve Miner, Mrs Voorhees herself was happy to make a brief comeback. Her scene was actually filmed when Steve Miner was unavailable, so the reins were handed to Miner's previous collaborator and soon-to-be horror movie legend, Wes Craven. Craven filmed Palmer's scene in Los Angeles, yet not being a fan of horror movies, the actress later admitted to never seeing her performance, as she'd never bothered watching any of the sequels. Meanwhile, Jason performer Steve Dash would declare he was quite proud of the nuances he gave his character in this scene, especially since he had to try and emote from underneath a burlap sack. Sadly, the scene wasn't achieved without incident. As Ginny and Jason face off with their respective weapons, Dash received a nasty injury courtesy of a mistimed machete strike from Amy Steele. The scene had been carefully choreographed, however a last-minute change resulted in the rather confused actress bringing her blade down too early and cutting deeply into Dash's finger. This required a trip to the hospital for the poor stuntman, who nonetheless returned a couple of hours later, all patched up and ready to continue filming. And while Steve Dash endured the physical pain of the incident, a frustrated and guilt-ridden Amy Steele lashed out at Steve Miner, asking quite fairly, why didn't we use a rubber blade instead? Also confused at Jason's return, effects wizard Tom Savini, who created the gruesome sequences for the original, declined to return for part 2, opting to work on the burning instead. Basically boycotting one camp killer for another, Steve Miner then consulted Stan Winston, who became a legend for his effects for the Terminator, Aliens and Jurassic Park, yet due to scheduling conflicts was unable to participate. Winston suggested that Steve Miner contact Dick Smith, the veteran makeup magician who created the groundbreaking effects for such films as The Exorcist. While Smith was a little out of the price range for such a low-budget film, he suggested one of his protégés, Carl Fullerton, to tackle the effects instead. Fullerton had worked with Dick Smith on Altered States and would also assist later that year on Ghost Story, and came highly recommended by the makeup veteran. Fullerton was reportedly quiet and kind-natured, yet his passion for creating grisly makeup and gruesome death scenes seemed to conflict with his pleasant demeanour. He was successful in creating several effect sequences for Friday 2, which sadly felt the wrath of the MPAA since much of his work wound up censored to avoid an X rating. One such effect included the death of Russell Todd's character Scott, who, after getting caught in a spring trap, has his throat cut with a machete. The effect was achieved similar to Robbie Morgan's character from the original, using a prosthetic neck carefully blended to match the actor. The appliance was created with a slit already pre-cut, which the actor would expose by leaning his head back as the blade was run across his throat. The wrong side of the blade for some reason. An off-camera technician would then pump blood through tubing hidden behind the appliance, resulting in one of the film's more harrowing effects. Russell Todd called his mum to let her know they were filming his death scene on his final day of shooting, which, as with Lauren Marie Taylor, had his mother questioning the legitimacy of the film they were making.
You're all doomed.
Coincidentally, the actor suffered an almost identical fate in the 1980 film He Knows You're Alone, which incidentally was Tom Hanks' feature film debut. However, the most infamous of Fullerton's scenes was the double impalement of Jeff and Sandra, in which Jason shish kebabs the pair with a spear as they're getting busy. Well, I guess that gives new definition to the term double penetrate. Don't say it. Yeah, you're probably right. The tragedy of this scene being all but excised becomes apparent when considering the time and effort that went into creating it. Bill Randolph was required to kneel on the floor through a hole cut out in the bed, while a foam latex replica of his back was carefully attached to his upper torso. Unfortunately, he had to remain in this hunched position for up to 6 hours at a time, which eventually earned him the sympathy of one well-intentioned crew member. Taking pity on him, an assistant wound up blowing a, to this day still unknown, powdered substance into Randolph's face. Come on guys, it was the 80s, we can guess what it was. Which the actor later admitted made the experience much more bearable. Sadly, some behind-the-scenes stills and recovered VHS footage are all that seem to remain of this effect. However, the scene was cut down even further for a far more understandable reason. A lengthier love scene between Randolph and his on-screen girlfriend was filmed but swiftly removed, since it allegedly contained some fairly explicit nudity from actress Marta, which may not have been an issue, yet Paramount later discovered she'd apparently been untruthful about her age and was all of 16 years old at the time it was filmed. Further still, this scene, among others, also raised some eyebrows due to their similarity to some of the gruesome kills in the 1971 film Bay of Blood. Also known as Twitch of the Death Nerve, the film also includes a double impalement, the death of a character in a wheelchair, and an unfortunate victim receiving a machete to the face. However, when confronted about the similarities to Mario Bava's film, all parties involved seemingly waved this off as pure coincidence.
This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
As horror movies are known to do, Friday the 13th Part 2 wanted to match the jump scare from the original with a final appearance of its supposedly dead antagonist. One of the few effects to actually survive the MPAA was Jason without his trademark burlap sack, with Warrington Gillette this time under some heavy prosthetics. For what ultimately amounted to just a few seconds on screen, Gillette nonetheless spent hours in the makeup chair in what he would say was an endurance test to be sure. This included keeping one of his eyes forcibly shut so he could wear a prosthetic eye for what would often amount to up to 12 hours on any given day. However, his discomfort only helped his performance, since he later quipped that the experience left him in such a foul mood that he simply wanted to murder someone. Fullerton was careful to base his design for Jason on his brief appearance in the original, which had a similar look to the extraordinary makeup for the Elephant Man. It's also been said that David Lynch's classic inspired Jason's burlap sack, yet since filming was already underway before The Elephant Man was released, this was also dismissed as a coincidence. However, more attuned horror fans will also compare Jason's look in Friday 2 with the killer's disguise in the 1976 film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which is rumoured to be no accident. Harry Manfredini returned to compose the score for Part 2 and felt more prepared this time around, since his direction from Steve Miner was repeat what you did in the first film. As such, the music for Part 2 does align with the original, yet introduces several new themes, making it one of the more distinctive soundtracks in the series. Manfredini stated that his music for Ginny impersonating Jason's mother is among one of his favourites, and I must say it's also one of mine, sounding ethereal and almost sympathetic.
That's a good boy. Now come to mommy.
The full soundtrack wasn't released until 2015, when Waxwork Records launched a 17-track vinyl that sports some truly impressive artwork. However, in 2017, La Land Records released a 28-track album known as The Ultimate Cut, featuring previously unreleased music, including cues not used in the final film. And while I'm not as fanatical about the score for Part 2 as I am for the original, I might just pick up the Waxwork Records released based on the artwork alone, because it absolutely slaps. Interesting side note, while not included on the soundtrack, one particular song heard during the prologue appears to be a clever foreshadowing of the film's events.
Down came the rain and washed the spider out.
In the opening scene, a child can be heard singing Itsy Bitsy Spider, which, intentional or not, seems to be an echo of Jason's story. I mean, how else do you interpret a song about something that once lived, only to drown and then resurface again?
Hello?
Friday the 13th Part 2 hit cinemas on April 30th, 1981, taking in approximately $22 million, about half what the original made, but still enough to greenlight future sequels. Slasher films at the time were not critical darlings, and Friday 2 was no exception, with Roger Ebert offering the film a lowest possible score of half a star. It would also be the critic's final printed review for the Friday the 13th series, declaring his thoughts on this film and its predecessor transferable to any future entries in the franchise. While many other reviews at the time were equally scathing, not everyone was ready to dismiss the film. Jackie Tully from the Arizona Star, while confused at the appeal of horror films, admitted it had some effective moments and did praise Carl Fullerton's makeup effects. There was also a consensus that Steve Miner did prove himself as a director nonetheless, quite possibly providing a more competent entry than Sean S. Cunningham's original. While Friday the 13th Part 2 is still underwhelming to most critics, fans of the horror genre have since reappraised the film as one of the series' highlights. While as formulaic as any other entries of the series, Friday 2 is often re-evaluated for its arguably best final girl, fairly likeable characters, and the expansion of the Jason lore. A novelization by Simon Hawke was published in 1988, which explores Jason's mindset quite significantly, while also explaining the events after his supposed drowning. The novel expands some of the other characters to a degree, but for the most part it does follow pretty much beat for beat the events of the film that true enthusiasts might want to check out. And speaking of books, I did flog this on my review of the original film and only mention it again because it is so worthwhile. Crystal Lake Memories, The Complete History of Friday the 13th by Peter Bracke is an absolute labour of love that fans of the series will not want to put down. My advice, grab the updated digital version, and there is an accompanying 7-hour documentary available on Blu-ray, which I must confess I have not seen, but have heard it is thoroughly enjoyable viewing. And there has been further development on A24's hugely anticipated Crystal Lake TV show. The prequel series, which takes place before the events of the original film, is set to star Linda Cardellini as Pamela Voorhees and Callum Vinson as young Jason. Danielle Koch is also set to play a character named Claudette, who I'm going to place my bets now is intended to be the same Claudette we see getting killed in the prologue of the original film. Adrienne King is also set to appear on the show, which is scheduled to air on Peacock in 2026, and I for one cannot wait. Available in Shout Factory's 2020 Friday the 13th box set, which I also plugged to death in my retrospective on the original, Friday 2 comes with its own massive array of extras. Included are interviews with Amy Steele, Steve Miner and Bill Randolph, as well as 2 commentaries featuring a number of other cast members reflecting on their experience making the film. One of the most notable extras, however, is a reel of deleted Gore footage that makeup artist Carl Fullerton has assembled, showing his effects in all their uncut glory. Unfortunately, having been transferred from videotape, this extra is not great in terms of quality, and it also lacks audio, but for now, it does appear to be the only available source for these scenes. While Shout Factory's Blu-ray transfer is excellent, it has, by many accounts, been surpassed by Paramount's 4K release. Released as a part of their Paramount Scares box set in the US, with standalone releases in the UK and Europe, the quality of the transfer is reportedly stellar. Sadly, my copy didn't arrive in time to preview for you guys, but the 4K transfer is apparently very detailed and is reportedly the best the film has ever looked. It's easy to compare Friday the 13th with the supernatural horror of A Nightmare on Elm Street and the more earnest tone of the Halloween films. Yet what I've always loved about this particular franchise is that it never pretends to be anything other than the B-grade time waster it is. I mean, the 10th film is set in space. Enough said. Not even die-hard fans go into this franchise expecting a classic, so I guess it remains consistent in terms of quality, since it's not hard to outdo what was only pretty average to begin with. Nor does it ever attempt to lecture its audience with an overly earnest philosophy and pretentious subtext. Looking at you, Halloween kills. Friday the 13th Part 2 has rightly earned its place as a favourite of the series by delivering arguably the best final girl, although Chris from Part 3 runs a close second. I mean, Ginny Yes used her wits, while Chris responded with brute force. I mean, you go girl. And of course, Part 2 gave us our proper introduction to Jason Voorhees, who, before his iconic hockey mask, looked amazing in the sack.
Phrasing?
And yes, while the final chapter and Jason Lives still reign supreme as the ultimate fan favourites, Part 2 standardised the slasher formula and set the tone for this beloved franchise.
Jason's out there.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 2 and where you'd rank it within the franchise, so feel free to leave me a comment and tell me which Friday film is your favourite. Please also consider giving that like button a stab, and if you haven't done so already, feel free to hit those subscribe and notification buttons. I will be taking a short hiatus from retrospectives for the next couple of months, but I will have one ready in time for Halloween, so stay tuned for that. But until then, please take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.